Many Tibetan texts on spiritual practice begin with a chapter on a practice known in Tibetan as Lama Naljor, or Lama Yoga, Guru Yoga. Sometimes it's called Lama Latemba, which means Lama Latensul, how to rely upon a guru, how to rely upon a lama. And one does so in both thought and in action. So why is Guru Yoga important? Why is relying upon a guru important? And I think it comes down to the basic fact that Buddhism is not a path of faith or devotion, but rather a practice of enlightenment experience. In other words, Buddha had a number of students. 500 of those achieved enlightenment during his lifetime. And then they had some students, and some of them achieved enlightenment, and others had students, and some of them achieved enlightenment. So this quality of transmission as a living enlightenment tradition, an experiential tradition, rather than a path of faith or devotion or whatnot, is a key point in the Buddhist world, and something I think that distinguishes it from some other traditions which are more faith-bound or faith-oriented. And this word faith in Buddhism even has something of a different meaning, because it really means something like Yichepe Deba in Tibetan. The kind of faith or confidence that is basically an inspiration. In other words, you meet a great master and you see this person has some special quality, and you think, were they born with that, or did they accomplish that? In my own case, when I met the Dalai Lama in 1972, I thought, my goodness, what an extraordinary person. He is such a beautiful spirit, such a beautiful soul. And then I met his great teacher, Ling Rinpoche, and again, it's like, wow, what a great being, what a great soul. And similarly, when I met Khyentse Trijang Rinpoche, Dalai Lama's other great teachers, wow, what a great being, what a great soul. Later, when I was studying, there's a passage in Shantideva which says, all the Buddhas were once ordinary beings, but they applied themselves to the training, and by applying themselves to the training, accomplished great enlightenment. And so then it becomes obvious that the Dalai Lama, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, Sakyatris, and the head of Sakya school, these people aren't wonderful beings because they were born wonderful. It's a combination of nature and nurture. They were born with some positive inclinations, but then they were placed in strong spiritual training and accomplished great spiritual states of mind. As it's said in Buddhism, they accomplished Buddha mind. They found their Buddha nature and brought the essence of the cream of the milk of that Buddha nature, extracted it, and made the butter of great enlightenment. And so, because it's an experiential tradition, it means it comes as a kind of a training. Again, going back to Shantideva, he says, even to learn to be a good fisherman, you should it helps if you apprentice under someone who is a good fisherman, who knows how to fish. Otherwise, it's just a matter of luck if you happen to throw your net in the right place, or whatever you catch. It's just a matter of luck. A carpenter helps to apprentice under a good carpenter. An engineer, it helps to actually go to college and learn engineering, and so on. So how much, so Shantideva goes on to say, how much more so for the Enlightenment tradition, where we want to learn the meditations, the yogas, and so forth, for extracting the butter coming from the cream from the milk of our own Buddha nature. So many texts start with Guru Yoga, or Lamala Tensul, how to rely effectively upon a spiritual teacher. And the Mahamudra of Tibet talks about 4 kinds of lamas to rely upon. The Rongchen Lama, the Lama which is one's own spiritual essence, you could say. In other words, it's the clear light nature of one's own mind, or the deeper nature of one's own mind, one's own Rongchen Deshin Shipe Rig, one's own natural Buddha quality. Sometimes some texts describe it as the emptiness of the mind, although when you say emptiness of the mind, what the heck does that mean to most people, right? So easier to say something like the Buddha essence, or I think there's a movement, in some Christian circles there's a movement to speak about the Christos within, the Christ within you, something like that. And that's probably an idea borrowed from this Buddha nature theory coming from India, with the Buddhist traditions, and the so-called spice route that traveled from Egypt, Alexandria, up through Jerusalem and Philistine, over through Persia and down into India. I often like to point out Christ was probably a closet Buddhist, because he disappears from age 12 to 28 mysteriously, and BBC did a documentary on that once, his Buddhist connections, if you will. And you can look it up on YouTube. So this one's own inner nature, one's own natural goodness, you could say, or emptiness of one's mind as a separate entity, meaning the connectivity of one's mind with all things. The opposite of emptiness is the connection with all things. Emptiness of us as a separate entity, therefore, from a other point of view, the connectivity to all things. So this is one's own deepest nature. So in a way, it's one's ultimate guru, or one's natural guru. And the other is the guru of one's own experience. One learns on a day-to-day level. Every day one has some experience, and one should learn from that. If one can learn from experience, one can go in a positive direction. Of course, many people resist learning from experience. Therefore, we often hear politicians say the very definition of insanity is to repeat the same mistakes over and over again without learning from them. That's not really a very good definition of insanity. But anyway, it's often quoted by political people for how the world of politics seems very resistant to learning from experience. And thirdly, Kagi Lama, which is the teacher one has in instructions, the words one hears or reads or so on. You know, people who read the Bible, read the Bhagavad Gita, read Lao Tse's Tao Te King, or read the Dharmapada, or other the great classics of the spiritual world of different traditions. There's some kind of a Lama in that. There's some kind of a guru in that. When you read the Bhagavad Gita and something you read resonates with you, it can have a transformative nature. But the problem is when we say Lama Latensul, how to rely upon that, how to extract the essence of that, how to get spiritual transformation from that. This becomes the issue. And this comes down to the fourth kind of Lama, listed in the Mahamudra literature, which is the Sawe Lama, the living master. In other words, those teachers, those lamas, those gurus, masters, who have trained under authentic lineage and achieved those qualities. If it's Bhagavad Gita, then some Indian Swami or master who trained in that tradition and actually got the results. Or if it's Taoism with the Tao Te King, Lao Tse's Tao Te King, some Taoist master who actually completed the training in a traditional way or in a lineage, correct lineage way, and under the supervision of a qualified teacher. So by having qualified teacher, it's a kind of a way to get around this problem humans have of self-obstruction. For instance, very often people will notice some character flaw you may have, and you won't actually notice it, and they'll be shy to perhaps mention it to you. We have this kind of quality as humans of very often being very defensive about what we are and where we are and all of these kind of issues. So the great benefit of a living teacher is they can sort of inspire us to push aside those fears of transformation, those fears of letting down our guard, those fears of removing obstacles from our paths. Because when you remove an obstacle, of course, it leads to going further down the path. And as the expression sometimes goes, the suffering that you know is sometimes easier to digest or to deal with than the fear of not having that suffering. Like people, for instance, getting out of prison after many years of prison often will go out and commit a crime, particularly to get back in prison. The fear of living in a non-known environment can be greater than can overpower the unpleasantness of living in the prison. So the great benefit of the living master is they can touch exactly what needs to be touched in terms of the point, the direction or the specific point our spiritual life should take. And if we just rely upon our own infinite mind, the first kind of Lama, or our own experience, another kind of Lama, or things we read, it can still remain very abstract and very general. But when we train under a living master who has accomplished those levels of personal practice, we can therefore be directed, we can then be directed to the very specific issue to be dealt with. It's perhaps similar to, say, if you go to a therapist or a psychologist. If you just read a book on psychology, that has one kind of benefit. That's like Kagi Lama, the Lama, which is the instruction. But if you go to a very qualified psychotherapist, they can sort of lead you through very specific issues that they notice are blocking your happiness or blocking your energy flow. So the living Lama is something like that, except rather than have it as a kind of a social function, as in psychology, it's directly a spiritual or an enlightenment function. So how do we practice Guru Yoga in thought and in action? The main thing in thought is to have a respectful mind and to have an open mind towards the training. And often this is done on a daily basis as a little Guru Yoga manual. So every Tibetan school has a few hundred of these little Guru Yoga liturgies. They're usually somewhat similar. One visualizes Buddha and thinks this is an embodiment of my guru. Looks like a Buddha, but it's actually my gurus, my lama or my lamas. And then one does a kind of a liturgical chant of devotion, if you will, or of dedication, usually mentioning the main points in the path to enlightenment. So I want to cultivate the joyful mind. Great Master, help me cultivate the joyful mind. I want to cultivate awareness of impermanence, of death and dying, the shortness of my life and the fragility of my life. Please inspire me to be aware of impermanence and transformation. I want to cultivate a deeper awareness of karmic law or karmic processes. Please inspire me to be able to understand on a deeper level. I want to cultivate universal love and compassion. Please inspire me to be more loving, compassionate. I want to cultivate great patience and great meditation. Please inspire me to be more meditative, more patient, and to make great progress in meditation. I want to cultivate wisdom and tantric yoga. Please inspire me to success in my wisdom training and in my tantric yoga practices, and so on. So this kind of practice is common to all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and very often a meditation session will begin with such a respectful request to the living masters with whom one is trained, and also to the lineages going back to the time of Buddha. I think many of the books I've published in English address some of these. The seventh Dalai Lama includes a couple of Guru Yogas in his Meditations to Transform the Mind. That's a book I did with Snow Lion in the early 80s. Now it's with Shambhala publication. Also the second Dalai Lama's selected works of the second Dalai Lama, and another book I did by him, Mystical Verses of a Mad Dalai Lama, has some of those kind of Guru Yoga practices in it. But the essence of the training is that the essence of the issue is to how to cultivate an effective relationship with the teacher. In other words, to not just be devoted to the teacher, but to actually extract the meaning. Geshe Ngawang Dargye, who had been appointed by the Dalai Lama to teach to us in Dharamsala, once put it this way: the hunter of musk hunts the musk deer, and when he sees the deer, he wants the musk. He doesn't ask, is it a pretty deer, is it a chubby deer, is it this or is it that? He wants the musk. So from our teachers, we want enlightenment. So how to extract enlightenment without all of the cultural or emotional or devotional trappings that sometimes go around that process. So in Buddhism, this is a very, very big issue. And it's always practiced on what the Buddha said late in his life. He said, be like an analyst buying gold, cut, check, test. Don't accept anything said by anyone just because I said it. In other words, if someone quotes the Buddha and says, Buddha said, well, that's not enough to accept something. So when we practice Dharma as under the teachers, to be somewhat critical, but to be positively critical, or to be open-minded about it. So Buddha goes on to say, you should test, cut, and burn like buying gold, goldsmith buying gold, cuts it and tests it and burns it to see that it's pure gold. In the same way, we should cut, test, and burn. And the Buddha in that verse goes on to say two things. Only if it makes sense to you should you accept a particular statement or a particular teaching. Is one condition. It should make sense to you. And secondly, if you try it, it should be beneficial. You should feel some benefit. So there's many things that can make sense to us that aren't necessarily benefit. Like Donald Trump is a little bit of an odd character to be president. We can think that over and say, well, yeah, that makes sense. But then if we sit and meditate on that, it's not actually going to make us into a better human being or bring about our enlightenment or anything like that. But there's how many types of ants on the planet, and we go, oh yeah, that could be true. We check it up, yeah, that's true. And we think, oh yes, there's 7,322 varieties of ants. And then we sit with that. It doesn't actually bring much benefit to us. Unless, we're collecting ants or something like that. So the second condition, that when we take it on as a spiritual practice, we should actually feel benefit. So that experiential side of the enlightenment process remains there, trumping all other Buddhist teaching. So you can have the Dalai Lama or a very great master as your teacher. He says something doesn't make sense to you. Dalai Lama at the end of many teachings often says, well, I covered many points in this 10-day teaching. If there's something you like and it feels beneficial, use it. Something you don't like, doesn't feel beneficial, just drop it. So in training with Guru Yoga, this becomes a very crucial and somewhat sensitive issue, because on the one hand, we don't want to use our fears of change to resist helpful advice, like fighting with your psychologist over, or your psychotherapist over something. But on the other hand, we don't want to be blindly following ideas or practices that make no sense to us, and when we try them, are of no benefit. So Lama Tenzul, relying effectively upon a teacher, means relying by thought, which means cultivating positive attitudes, and relying in action, which mostly, I think, as Woody Allen puts it in one of his movies, mainly comes down to showing up.
푸른 산등 흩들어오던 수밀지지 하르기던 하우틀러 탑질라서니 무릉 골리고스 멜리리 팅큰 텔리리 팅큰 바이님이 기띠기친 유르도 들지테 히띠리 테리 힝우금 보르 흥가에다 노타게민